Now, the most famous element of Etruscan art is going to be their tombs, in large part because this is what frequently survives. The problem with the Etruscans is immediately following the Etruscans, we have the Romans, who will take over really the same area, and thereby destroying a lot of the Etruscan pieces to be replaced with Roman architecture and Roman sculpture. So we start at one of the very famous necropolises. This is an example from Cerveteri, but we're going to be dealing with Banica necropolis. And what we see is, you see these mounds. Each of those mounds is a tomb. And the paths and such are kind of cut in. So what you're seeing is raised area, part of which is cut in and then part of which is mounded. And they would have looked something like this up close. You can see where it's bedrock and then there's soil built up on top. So the typical tomb is a mound tomb. Etruscan tombs covered one or more subterranean, multi-chambered tombs and were cut from the local limestone known as tufa. And they're arranged in orderly fashion, often resembling a home. And we're going to start with the Tomb of the Reliefs. Now here we see several generations that would have been kept in the same tomb. For example, when someone died, they would be put in one of these larger cutouts, probably wrapped. As they decay and they become a skeleton, they would be moved to a narrower cutout. And once everything has broken down and the bones start to break down, then they would be moved into an ostiary box, a bone box, and put on the shelf. So we would have multiple generations of a family in this tomb. It could hold a considerable number of people. And what we see is all of this carving. All of these are items they would need in the afterlife. Although unlike the Egyptians, who actually put the items in, the Etruscans are carving symbolic items on the wall because they don't necessarily have the resources to bury everything someone would need in their tomb. And you'll notice most of this relates to domestic life. Ropes, axes, a cat. Cats should be buried. That's kind of where they belong. Everything you would need in the afterlife. And it basically creates a house for the dead. At the back, you see a three-headed dog. That's an image of Sybaris, the three-headed dog who guards the underworld, and probably relates to this idea of passing from life to death. And again, this whole thing is carved out of the bedrock, so you can just imagine the amount of effort that would have gone into creating a tomb like this and how important the afterlife must be to Etruscan society to do something like this. But this isn't the only example. We also have the Tomb of the Leopards. And this is named for the lions on the back wall. Seeing mythology is actually fairly uncommon. What we see here is primarily banqueting couples, with the male with darker skin, the female with lighter skin. You notice they're almost interchangeable. The figures look very, very similar. There's little to tell apart. And we actually have sort of this idea of the male on the right, the female on the left, and then they get swapped later on. So very interesting ideas of how the Etruscans treat gender. They actually see males and females as incredibly similar and would have given almost complete equal rights to women. The servants are there to serve the guests, and those are the standing figures, the two nude standing figures. They also would have had music to entertain them, and all the figures seem to be moving, talking, doing something. It is very dynamic. And this is again about the celebration of life rather than mourning death. In some ways, it kind of would look backwards to the Greeks because we see no interest in foreshortening. we're not seeing a lot of technical advancement here. Yet, we're also seeing something very forward-looking in the interest in nature and in this very dynamic nature of the scene with all of this movement going on. Then we have the tomb of hunting and fishing. And here we see a youth diving from a rocky protrusion. Here's the youth, here's the cliff, and beneath we actually have another youth climbing up. Beneath we have people fishing. Hopefully he's going to have enough space there. He's going to end up rather alarmingly being caught in their boat. Nearby we see others fishing from a boat, and the whole thing is brightly painted. And if we look at the cliff, stylistically it looks very similar to the spring fresco at Thera. The same sort of colors, the same sort of plant life, and again we have the birds flying around, possibly speaking to vitality in the afterlife. They have a great love of nature, much like the Minoans, meaning that this is a group where hunting, fishing, being in the outdoors is not seen as lower class. It may have been more widely accepted. They may have even shopped at REI. And this may be influenced by the Greek tomb diver, with the same idea of that transition from life into death being symbolized by the dive, in this case off a cliff into what is clearly a body of water and not a large gray pile of jello.